And I'd like to set the stage by describing where we're at in terms of prevalence of mental health issues in the general population in Israel. It's important to see what's going on, especially during times of the war, to inform the public health policy and resource allocation, and help design prevention and intervention strategies. Okay. So there are two main goals in this presentation. First, I will describe the current prevalence of common mental health problems and potentially addictive substance use and behaviors, and whether those differ by age, gender, and religiosity groups. And second, we will look at change over time in these outcomes from before the beginning of the war and over the course of the war until February 2025 to see what may be increasing perhaps in response to the war. Are people may be using addictions to cope with ongoing stress, and also to see, besides the general population level, what kind of changes there are, but are there specific groups by sociodemographics that may be changing differently? Just describe what's going on in Israel. At the end, I will briefly discuss some associations between mental health issues and various problematic potential addictions, and see what could be driving some of those relationships. Okay. To do this, we have a very rich data set of epidemiological data. It's collected from the general population of adult Jews in Israel at a number of time points. Data were collected using a survey company iPanel, and the samples indicated in blue, April 2022, December 2023, February 2025, are repeated cross-sectional samples, each designed to match the general Jewish population on key sociodemographics, so they're quasi-representative of the adult Jewish population in Israel to get a snapshot of what's happening at that time. At each time point, those who participated previously were also invited to participate again. And additionally, the data sets in green were sampled from among those that were sampled in December 2023. So we also have longitudinal data on the individual level on a subset of the sample. Okay. Data that was collected that was similar over each time point included sociodemographics, a problematic use of non-medical use of substances, problematic potentially addictive behaviors, and mental health issues like PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Things that may have differed slightly from different time points were like risk factors or protective factors, depending on what was going on. For example, in the December 2023 data set, we asked questions about exposure to the October 7th events. Okay. The questionnaires that are used in the surveys, as well as information about all our surveys, are generally available on the ICAMH website, specifically here under resources. Okay, so just to get a snapshot of what is going on in terms of our most current data, we're looking at the prevalence of binary measures of addiction, problematic use of substances and behaviors, and of mental health. We see that in general, what we're talking problematic use of behaviors and substances ranges from about 3% to about 13%, except for tobacco. And we can see that problematic use of alcohol, cannabis, sedatives pretty much have similar prevalence. And we also see that, for example, PTSD, potential PTSD, let's say, is about 15%, anxiety and depression is slightly lower. These are still kind of high numbers that are pretty high. Just to mention that we're talking about prevalence of binary outcomes, like problematic use, yes, no, potentially problematic, issues with depression, anxiety, yes, no. These are all threshold dependent. So you may see other numbers in other places, like in Israel, depending on what measure they're using and what threshold they're using. But either way, this gives you a snapshot of what seems to be going on, and these issues seem to be, they're substantial issues and they're prevalent in the population using our most current data. Okay. In the same data, we also wanted to ask this general population, which groups are the most vulnerable? And looking at using logistic regression, just to see if the likelihood of a particular outcome is higher, let's say, for example, here in men versus women. And we could see that for a number of substances like tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, as well as behaviors like problematic use of gambling, problematic sexual behavior, pornography, are all higher risk for men in February 2025. And alternatively, problematic use of social media, depression and PTSD, women were at higher risk, as we often see. Surprisingly, women were not specifically at higher risk for depression. Moving on to looking at differences by age, comparing 4 age groups to the oldest age, we can see that in general, most of these outcomes have lower prevalence in the oldest age for most of the substances, behaviors, and mental health issues. The exception is we see that for problematic use of sedatives is highest in the oldest age group, and problematic use of prescription opioid painkillers there are no differences by age in this case. So we see that youngest age groups in general show the highest prevalence of potentially problematic addictive behaviors and substance use, and the highest levels of potential mental health issues. A third comparison is looking at groups by religiosity. In Israel, there are very specific groups. People generally tend to know where they are, where they put themselves in terms of religious behaviors and somewhat cultural as well, cultural and beliefs. So we have a secular group, a traditional group, and then those are considered like, say like not religious in a sense, and then you have religious and ultra-Orthodox groups. They're both, I would say, religion and cultural definitions. But in general, religiosity is considered to be protective for mental health disorders. And here we see similar pattern in some of the cases that there's lower prevalence of addictions or mental health issues, for example, like PTSD and anxiety, in the religious groups, and higher prevalence in the secular and traditional groups. Okay. So just to summarize quickly what we're seeing in our current data set, substance and behavioral addictions, mental health issues are prevalent. In general, women are at increased risk for problematic use of social media, anxiety, and PTSD, where men are at higher risk for problematic use of substances like alcohol, cannabis, and tobacco, certain behaviors. In general, age risk decreases as age increases, except for problematic use of sedatives, which tended to increase with age. And religiosity, in some sense, seems to be protective for some behaviors and some problematic substance use, as well as some mental health disorders. What's more interesting is, in my mind, to see what actually, this is a snapshot of what's happening now, but what happened over the course of the war. Okay, so we have a longitudinal subset of the sample, which is defined as individuals who were surveyed in April 2022, which is time point one, and at least one time point after. And we used multiple imputation to fill in the 16% of missing data. And our question was, looking at each of these specific outcomes, what kind of change are we seeing over time? So we used logistic regression to fit the best shape of change. Is there a linear increase? It could be a curve that could be decreasing and then going back up. So we tried to fit the best pattern of change over time. And we also said, well, we know that we have a potential transition point at October 7th at the beginning of the war. So do we see a different kind of change? We can use a piecewise model to say, does the piece from April 2022 to December 2023, which is our first data point after the beginning of the war, does that look different than the piece from December 2023 until February 2025? Does there seem to be some sort of transition, as we might expect in some sense? And then we also look to see if these change, there's change, how things change, do it differ by sociodemographics? Okay? And just to keep in mind that this is a subset of the sample. So the results that we're discussing is for the subset and may or may not be generalizable to the entire sample that we are measuring overall. Okay, so just looking at each outcome specifically to say, where do we see changes that may be important to keep track of? In this case, we see 3 piecewise models that best fit the data. In tobacco, we actually saw a significant decrease in the first piece from before to immediately after the war, and then there's stabilization over time at a lower level of prevalence of problematic use of tobacco. And for alcohol, we saw the opposite effect. Initially, there was a slight decrease, but then there was an increase in prevalence of problematic use of alcohol over the course of the war. And with problematic use of misuse of prescription sedatives, we saw a steep increase in the beginning of the war, and then an ongoing slower increase, but it's still increasing. For other substances, problematic use of cannabis and problematic use of misuse of prescription stimulants, overall we see no change over time. And with misuse, non-medical use of prescription opioids, we saw a little more complicated pattern, initial increase followed by a curve where there was a decrease and then seems to be going back up. For problematic behaviors, we see also different patterns for each of different behaviors. We saw initial decrease in problematic use of sexual behaviors, and then followed by additional slight decrease. Whereas for pornography, problematic use of pornography showed no significant change. For gaming, we saw problematic use of gaming, a slight increase at the beginning, followed by stabilization and perhaps going down. Other behaviors, problematic use of gambling, we saw a similar type of curve but more extreme, with a greater increase but then a greater decrease perhaps. Similarly for problematic use of social media. And then we see for problematic use of internet, we see the beginning, a big increase, and then a stabilization at a higher level. Just to finish up with the overall patterns, for mental health disorders, as mentioned, for example, for potential PTSD, it gets mostly not post anything, hopefully we'll get to the post part, increase in the number of people with symptoms that could reach a threshold level of post-trauma. Immediately after, followed by a decrease. Just in terms of the PTSD, I'd want to mention that after December 2023 and on, we asked specifically about PTSD due to the war. So before the war, we asked PTSD due to any potential traumatic event that could have happened in a lifetime. From PTSD, we asked, and now we've been asking about due to the war. So the numbers that we're seeing is not equivalent, meaning we see that there's an increase in PTSD due to the war after the beginning of the war, and then there's a decrease, but we don't have good measure overall PTSD. So what you're seeing is probably, it's lower than it was actually there. We did not measure measures of anxiety and depression in April 2022, so we don't actually have we can't tell you how much it went up. From other studies in Israel, as we know that anxiety and depression did go up from before the war to the beginning of the war, but we are from a probable peak in December 2023, in a sense, we are seeing a decrease. So, summary of the trends to say, yes, we see some piecewise models that definitely this transition for some of the outcomes seems to be the beginning of the war is a change point. We see that there's different patterns for different outcomes, and with each of the outcomes, there are differences in what's going on. So some cases we do see, there is an increase, like for sedatives, and they continue increasing. But for alcohol, there was a decrease, and then there was an increase. Or for some of the behaviors, we saw a curve where there was an increase at the beginning, and then maybe people said, we have to have other ways of coping, so there was a decrease. So that we have to continually monitor, as we discussed in the previous panel at the end, hopefully we'll see an end, and there'll be time for us to start after the war. So after the war, as I said, to expect people to say we've been under a lot of pressure, under a lot of stress, and now things are going to finally, we're going to start dealing with what happened, then things are going to change again. So we have to continually monitoring to see what's actually going on. Besides the overall trends, we also have to say, so these are nice and all to see on a general level. What are the specific groups that may be vulnerable? So then we look at differences by gender. Here we're looking, I'll show you a few examples, trying to go into any of them in detail because we don't have that much time at this point. But men are blue, women are in red. In general, men show higher levels. But we also see different patterns. For example, the pattern of decrease in tobacco use that I showed previously is actually happening in the men, where there's no change in problematic tobacco use in women. They are lower levels to begin with, but they're not seeing any change. Conversely, for stimulants, where overall problematic use of prescription stimulants, we didn't see any change overall, but we actually see an increase in women. So the overall trends are nice to say what's going on in general population. We also have to look at different groups and say specific groups, what's going on in those groups. Okay? We also see differences by gender in terms of mental health, which I think is very interesting. Historically, we've always said in epidemiology studies, women are more likely to have depression and anxiety, or to report symptoms of depression and anxiety and PTSD. And here we're seeing those differences in the beginning, but we're seeing convergence between men and women. To see in anxiety, the decrease is greater in women, but not as great in men. And actually in depression, we see a different shaped curve, where depression actually went up in men and then started going down. And I think that's something that we really have to think about in terms of what's going on, because it's different results that we've been getting all along. Differences by age. Again, we also see that in blue is the younger group, and the red is the older group. We see like alcohol is increasing in both groups, but it's increasing faster in the younger group. In gaming, problematic gaming, we didn't see any change overall, but we're seeing an increase in problematic gaming in the younger group. Gambling, we see this big change where increase and decrease only in the younger group. And also, for example, with PTSD and also with depression and anxiety, the rate of change in the younger group is much greater. A greater increase and then a greater decrease. We see a lot more volatility in the younger group. So, similarly, differences by religiosity. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but we do see different patterns in different groups. In some cases, for example, the ones that I brought in cannabis and tobacco, we still see maintenance of the protective effect, where the non-religious groups are still higher prevalence than the religious groups, but that's not what we're seeing in all the outcomes. So again, to see like traditionally what we said, one thing, this is protective, what's actually going on? What is driving these protective or risk effects that can teach us more about what's happening, and what are the groups that need the most intervention or prevention? Just to summarize, again, we saw differences and perhaps different stress responses. Tells us that there's a need for tailored interventions and further study to understand the differences. I just wanted to show one example, a further study that was led by Uri Lifshin and Chagit Bonenoch from showing that we talked about the gambling curve. The problematic gambling curve was like a curve went up and then it went down. And they showed, looking in more detail at problematic gambling, that this increase, the initial increase shown in dark black, was among men who additionally had problems with emotional regulation. So looking at an overall pattern tells us what's going on an overall level, and that's important in the general population. Then looking at specific groups to say, okay, which are the most vulnerable groups, where we have to think about intervention, prevention, tailored and tailored strategies. But then even within the most vulnerable groups, like men that had change in general in problematic gambling, which are the most vulnerable men? We have a curve that's not straight, maybe something's going on, it's a mix of different curves, and then we can see it's men at risk, in this case, men with problems with emotional regulation. There's a lot of work to figure out exactly what, which groups to focus on and what to understand what's really going on. I'd like to just finish quickly by talking a little bit more about the connections between addictions and mental health. And we know that, we talked about it in the first panel, about how we know that mental health problems, PTSD, anxiety, depression come along with problematic use of substances and addictions. And here we want to say, if we're looking at data from 2023, and here we're looking at continuous measures of these outcomes. Before we talked about prevalence of binary measures, these are continuous measures. We want to say, if we look at each of these outcomes, these measures individually, they're all going to be related to each other, every pair. For example, in this figure, where each measure is an ellipse, is an oval, and the lines are showing the correlation between the different measures. And in this case, it's each pair looking together. For example, PTSD with problems internet use, or depression with PTSD. And everything is going to be related. But what we really want to understand is how many of these relationships are actually unique and direct between these pairs, as opposed to being driven by other things that are related to each other within the same set. So we use a method called network analysis to simultaneously look at the correlations between all of these measures that we know are interrelated and to distill out the unique effects. And what we actually see is that we see some clusters as we expect. The substances and gambling, problematic measures of substance use and gambling are related. Problematic technology behaviors, internet, social media, smartphone are strongly related. Problematic mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and PTSD, they're all strongly related. But what was interesting to us to see is which of the potential addictive behaviors are most strongly related to which of the mental health disorders, and to focus on the technology cluster related to the mental health cluster. And we want to know, what could be driving this association? What could be driving this strong, unique, direct association between the higher somebody scores on problematic use of social media, the higher that they will score on PTSD severity or depression and anxiety. So taking the example of problematic social media use and PTSD and being related to higher levels of PTSD, we did further studies that showed that increased exposure to hate speech on social media networks was associated to increased PTSD level scores. And that the effect of this increased exposure of hate speech was greater for people with difficulties in emotional regulation. So people who, as it is, have trouble dealing with difficult emotions when they're exposed to hate speech on social media will have stronger effects on their mental health. Additionally, in this study and in another study, we also showed that the increased exposure to uncensored materials related to the war, which was 95% of that was done online, either through the internet or social media, increased risk for higher scores on PTSD. So in contrast to the DSM-5, where by definition, a digital exposure or media exposure is not traumatic, to be considered a traumatic event to be measured for PTSD, we are showing that what somebody sees or hears or is exposed to in the digital realm can actually have a strong effect on their mental health. So it's important to raise awareness of these effects amongst the public. People can make healthy, informed choices, and also important for informing public policy. So to summarize what I've discussed and what we've found, in both currently and over time, substance and behavioral addictions and mental health issues are prevalent. In general, the higher risk groups we looked at, we could say, are men for most substances, some behaviors, and for young people, for substances, behaviors, and mental health issues, and also to some extent non-religious group, whereas women are a higher risk for some mental health issues. We saw different patterns over time for different outcomes by gender, by age, by religiosity, and we would also, when we look in other vulnerable groups, like by looking at soldiers who are in the army or their families, we also see a different effect. So besides summarizing and looking at different patterns over time in general and in the specific groups that we did, there are a lot of other groups that are both within our data sets or other groups groups that need to be studied to see what's going on. And we also just showed briefly that talked about the association of technology and PTSD. In terms of limitations of our studies, the first main limitation we have is representativeness. These studies that I discussed were only carried out among adult Jewish populations. In Israel, we definitely need to expand to set up culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate studies in other important populations in Israel, like the Arab population and other populations. Additionally, in our longitudinal study, where we showed change over time, it's only people who were agreed to be surveyed at the initial time point and at least one time point after. And definitely the people who agreed to be surveyed over time changed. People who agreed to be surveyed later had lower levels of problematic use and addictions and lower levels of mental health disorders. And therefore, we need to also understand what's going on. How to do a study. We have to actually, we have to keep going every year and saying what's going on, but also in terms of what's changing over time, we have to have follow people on a daily basis, ecological momentary assessments, or even using smartwatches, say, what's really going on when things happen. So we can get both an overall picture of the populations in Israel, as well as change, on day by day change, which can be very important as things seem to happen quickly, and what's really going on. We also talked about prevalence of dichotomous outcomes, which is dependent on threshold, so it may differ. The measures that we used were self-report, retroactive, which can lead to bias. And again, another reason why we'd want to say, let's look at people on daily measures or more frequent measures, so there's much less recall bias, or even using like smartwatches that measures things without having to, like measuring how much are people using social media, what are they doing, what's actually going on, how are they reacting when they're doing it. And additional studies that we can do are talking about, for example, looking at latent classes of specific outcome, which are the people who are more likely to initially have high levels of depression, but then goes down over time, or initially have high levels of PTSD and then stays high. And what are the risk factors or the protective factors that predict which group somebody would be in? Would they, initial reaction to be, have initial acute reaction and then to be more resilient? And why are they more resilient? And how? And what are the factors that affect both the initial reaction and over time the maintenance of a specific outcome or resilience returning back to, let's say, baseline. And then just in terms of the implications and the conclusions, one idea is to provide public health information about what's actually going on in terms of prevalence of addictions and mental health disorders in Israel, to raise awareness of potential problems and enable appropriate allocation of resources. To also raise awareness on the individual level that we're all under continuous stress and trauma. Everybody has their way of coping. We need to choose what's appropriate, both in the short term and what's adaptive and the most healthy in the long term. For example, we can now suggest that it's important to raise public awareness about the potential of problematic use of internet, which has gone up and seems to be staying up, and the problematic use of social media, including exposure to uncensored graphic war-related materials and hate speech to increase risk for PTSD. People can make informed choices. And this information can also be helpful for intervention and prevention policies, and the need to show the need for regular monitoring in terms of what's going on. So thank you for your attention, and thank you to all my colleagues at the ICAMH. And I'm happy to take questions. I think there's 2 more minutes. Sorry.